His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told, keep on dancing, won't ever get old.
Hello and welcome to the Long Island History Project, the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz, I am your host, and our opening music is courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. Today we are going hyper-local with the episode, so if you did not grow up within a 5-mile radius of our guest, just hold on. It should all make sense, and it's an exercise in exploring how one man's life, all the pieces of it, crosses over with a lot of other aspects of history and what we can glean from our own personal histories. And just a few notes, this was recorded about 2 weeks ago, so in our section about podcasting, one of the things we talk about already has come to pass. And also, content-wise, we do have a brief mention of a suicide about 7 minutes in. But mostly we are rolling through the 70s and 80s along Montauk Highway, those hazy, crazy days of high school and the summer, and getting to know today's very special guest.
Rob Walch, and I'm with Libsyn, and I grew up in Bayport.
Thank you, Rob, for joining us tonight. We're on Libsyn Connect, so we're running that through its paces. It's looking good. And I'm calling this episode, This Is Your Long Island Life, because we're going to spend some time, if you don't mind, spelunking through your past. The preparation I did for this, I drive home from Stony Brook. I usually come down Nichols Road, and I usually get off at Sunrise, but I went all the way down to Main Street, hung a right, and I just kind of soaked in Main Street, Bayport to kind of prepare myself. So do you want to explain for people that aren't from the island or haven't been here in a while where you grew up?
I grew up in Bayport, New York, which is right at the end of Nichols Road. It's, if you're going south, it's where they have the signs that keep getting taken out every so many months because people don't realize Nichols Road ends, and then the car will drive through the sign. But if you go at that at the end where you are supposed to make a left or a right, that's Montauk Highway. And if you make a right, that takes you into Bayport. And then it's on the other side of Bayport is Sayville. So when people aren't sure where Bayport is, I usually tell them we're right between Sayville and Patchogue.
Yeah, and that'll place you. Yeah. So when was your youth? What time frame were you growing up there?
I was born in '66, so I was growing up in the '70s and '80s, basically right along with the time frame of Stranger Things. I was kind of mirroring that, couple grades ahead of where those kids would have been, but growing up on Long Island, just not in Indiana, but the neighborhood where I grew up, eerily similar to that, because where I grew up in Bayport, my house was surrounded on two sides by woods, and I'm talking hundreds and actually over 1,000 acres of woods, and part of it was a Girl Scout camp. Camp Edie's there. So literally right up next to my house, on one side of my property was my parents' property is Camp Edie, and then the other part is the Sanssouci Wildlife Reserve. So
you were north of Montauk.
North of Montauk, yep.
I live in Sayville. I didn't grow up here, but I grew up around the same time period. So I'm going to throw in some things, some word association maybe. But so did you grow up watching the growth of the light show at the Girl Scouts?
There was no light show there when I grew up. It started after I had moved away. So I moved away for college. I left for college in '84, August of '84. So I was back a couple of summers. But yeah, I moved off the island permanently in the '80s.
Okay, because that became, I'm sure your parents mentioned, it became a horror show of traffic, and it was a beautiful light show. But
it was really, yeah, and I did go because we would go back to my parents every year for Christmas, and we would go to the light show, and it's a shame that they closed it down. I know that there was some traffic, but still, it was good for the Girl Scouts. They raised a lot of money, and they had a really nice show, and definitely a lot of people driving through. You could see it from my parents' house. You can see in the woods. You can see the cars driving through.
That's nice. So if you put yourself in your own version of Stranger Things, what was your youth like, the summer days with the friends and the bikes? And
Yeah, I mean, first off, again, we had the Girl Scout camp next to us, which when you're growing up as a teenage boy is kind of funny to have a Girl Scout camp right next to you where you would go and do things that you probably shouldn't do. They had canoes, and every so often we would go down to one of the lakes and we would grab a canoe, and we wouldn't steal it, but we would appropriate it for the day and canoe up a couple of lakes and go canoeing around and park the canoe maybe in a stream. Still in the Girl Scout camp. So never took it off the property, but we'd have some fun there. We would try to scare the girls at night when banging on their tents and yelling, and then they would get chased by this guy who was in a yellow pickup truck, would chase us. So we used to call him Old Man Clink. Was his nickname.
I was going to ask you, I've asked this to someone else too. What were the scary stories when you were a kid growing up? The haunted houses or just the local legends?
The old man Clink was the one that people would say, oh, if you watch out, he's got a salt gun. He'll shoot you with the salt gun. So you worried about that. Then on the other side of the street I lived at, the other end, was Bayport Aerodrome. So I was right in between that and what at the time was called Edwards Airport. And
okay.
So we would go down and watch airplanes taking off from the aerodrome, do dumb things. Like there was this hay field at the very north end of the runway, and the planes would come and they would turn around before they would take off. And these are propeller planes. It's a dirt runway. And the goal was you would lay in the hay, and the plane would come, it would turn around, the tail would go. And then when the guy revved the engine, you would try to run up and touch the tail and jump. And blown back from the wash. And then someone would notice, and then this guy would come down in a Jeep and chase you off the property.
Yeah, I forgot that. I've interviewed those people. So they restore old airplanes, and you see them flying over the town.
Right. And back in the day, before, when I was real young, my dad told stories about when it was Edwards Airport in back in the late 60s. They used to do drug drops there. Planes would fly over and drop satchels of drugs, and people would pick them up. Yeah. So there was some interesting history with that airport, but I guess it's the oldest continuous use dirt runway airport in the world.
It might be one of the only, or one of the last few in New York, at least, definitely. So what else would you do for fun?
Again, with the woods, we would build. Did a lot of building of forts. People would dump cars. They would steal cars and dump them in the woods, and then you try to be the one to found the car. And interesting stories. You go through there, find what people left in cars, or people dump trash, and you try to salvage whatever they had to build your fort out of it. One time, freshman year in high school, we were cutting through the woods to the Sunvet Mall. I should put my New York accent back on.
It'll come back.
The mall, and which they had the subway where you play video games. And me and two friends were walking through this path, and we see this guy you can see him just stand. We thought he was standing there, and we're like, hey, because those hunters would go back there shooting rabbits. And we say, hey, don't shoot, kids coming through. The guy didn't move. We walk up, and the guy had killed himself.
Oy.
Yeah, so we found him, and we go back to our house, and we tell my dad and my dad and his friend were over. They were doing some work on the house, and we go, hey, we just found this guy hanging literally in the woods. And they're like, what? And so my dad was a police officer. They called the police. He called up the police department, told them what happened. So being traumatized as we were like, hey, let's go back to the mall because that's where we're going. So we go back to go to the mall, and the police are there saying, hey, you guys can't come through here. We're like, well, hey, we found the guy. So they wouldn't let us go back through the crime scene that we found. But it wound up being the guy had committed suicide, sadly.
That's too bad. Was your dad, what precinct was he in?
5th precinct and the 2nd precinct. So he did 5th, and then he went to 2nd, and then he came back to 5th, and he retired out of the 5th.
You mentioned the mall, and I'm roughly the same age, and so I was going to ask you where you saw your first Asteroids game. Where were you playing that?
Asteroids would have been at Subway, yeah, the arcade there in the South Shore Mall.
Was that a big part of the whole video game craze? Did you have an Atari and all?
Oh yeah. We started out actually before the Atari. We had an Odyssey, Magnavox Odyssey. Then we had Atari 2600. Then I got an Atari 800. So yeah, that was my video game craze. But yeah, we spent a lot of time and money up at the mall for sure.
Now, as I was driving home tonight, Was Hot Bagels around back then? I don't know if they go back that far. Where was
No.
your bagel store?
Well, see, my dad was a police officer, so he would come home with the bagels. Right? He'd get off the shift. He'd have midnight shift, and it would be great. He'd have mid shift, and he'd come home with a brown bag of bagels somewhere from Patchogue or somewhere like that. Growing up, that was one of the advantages back then. The police they treat them a little different than they do today. We get the bagels, but it was usually out of someplace in Patchogue. But yeah, Hot Bagels. I think they opened. I want to say late '80s. Maybe it was mid '80s.
Okay.
You're talking about the one right there on
Right in Sayneville, yeah.
right on Montauk Highway. Yeah.
What about pizza? What's your favorite?
Satellite Pizza. I worked at Satellite Pizza, so
Did you?
I was
Okay.
a Satellite Swahili, is what we used to call ourselves back then, and yeah, that was great because back in the day you could leave. I don't know if they still can, but I went to Bayport Blue Point Public High School, which is right near there, and you could go out for lunch. So anyone could leave. So when I was working there, you'd go up to Satellite and get a free slice of pizza. If you worked there, you get free pizza. So that was a nice perk of that, and had the best. If you haven't been to Satellite, best calzones, still have the best calzones because they deep fry them. No baking. It's deep fried the way it should be.
We've been going there a lot lately. We usually go to Sayville, Sal's in Sayville, but I don't know if you noticed or watched. It took them 10 years to build. They were extending the restaurant. Finally, they got it open. Yeah,
Forever. I feel so bad for the guys, but yeah, I worked there with the original owner, Michael Polizzi, and I worked right up until a week before I left for college. So I was 16, 17 working there. That was a great part-time job when you're in high school.
Now, what's interesting, you've mentioned a few places. So you lived in between, we'll mention Meadowcroft and explain what that is, and Sans Souci, and the Aerodrome is pretty famous. When you were that age growing up, did any of that history get to you? Did you know anything about the history of the area?
The Aerodrome, again, we called it Edwards Airport. It did, I kind of knew the history because I used to drive down to the end of my street and just hang out. We'd watch in the summertime when we were kids. We just watched the planes taking off and sometimes even seeing them crash. Saw a couple actually crash. We were the first ones on the scene, me and my friends. You didn't have internet back then. So
That's right. Entertain yourself.
Spent a lot of time on the bike, right? And we would drive into the woods. And so the woods and the Aerodrome, it really were a lot of our youth growing up, and then playing sports. I mean, it was one of those communities where everybody was basically the same age within plus or minus a couple of grades. There were on my street, there were 4 other kids from my grade, a couple more, at least another 4 or 5 that were a couple of years older or 2, and 4 or 5 that were a couple of years younger or 2. So there was a lot of, we would play street hockey. We had the basketball hoop on the telephone pole in front of my house. We played a lot of hoop basketball on that. You remember STPs? We used to have STP races in our street.
Oh, yeah.
Because we were lucky enough. I was in the end of the street, end of the subdivision. So my street was the last street in the subdivision on a cul-de-sac. Or circle. I can't remember what we called the circle, right? Cul-de-sacs. I've been in the Midwest too long, but it was a circle, at the end of the street there. And it was the end of the community. So really we got very few people that would come through. Now, funny things we would do, people would come through thinking they could get through our subdivision and get up to the mall or up to Sunrise Highway, and they would come through and then we would give them the worst directions on how to actually get there.
You'd never see them again.
Yeah. We figure, we'll see how bad we can make this person get lost.
Did you get down to the bay at all? Were you ever sailing or?
I would go down. We'd go down and go crabbing. So we'd have crab cages. We'd go down in the summertime, go crabbing. Sometimes fishing for snapper. So we'd do that in the summer as well. Ride our bikes. Now we rode our bikes everywhere. I mean, I'd ride into Sayville, ride into Patchogue. More Sayville though. It was. Me and my friends, when we would go, it was easier to ride into Main Street, into Sayville, go to the movie theater there, and the Carvel. There wasn't a Carvel in Bayport when I grew up. Now there is one there.
Okay.
But there wasn't one when I was growing up.
Now, you mentioned playing hockey in the street. So on the island in the early 80s, we're talking the dynasty. Were you a hockey fan?
Oh, I was an Islander fan. Used to go to the Islander games. Yep, absolutely. Was at one of my grandfather was in the unions on Long Island. He was basically the guy that gave out the jobs, and so so he had some influence. And it was the painters union on Long Island for Nassau and Suffolk. So he would be able to get us in the back door at Nassau Coliseum, and we would go to Islander games. Like whenever I sleep over at Christmas time, he'd take me to an Islander game. And my favorite Islander game was when they played the Russians. So I got to sit on the Zamboni and watch the game from the Zamboni, except when they were using it, which was great. And I have a couple of hockey pucks around still from Islanders.
Oh, that's great. Now, you mentioned high school, so to combine that with the sports, tell us about the rifle team.
Yes, believe it or not, the schools used to have rifle teams, and Bayport had a rifle team. We had a rifle range right under our cafeteria. I was captain of the team. We went undefeated my senior year, went to state my junior and senior year. So we had a really good run. Our coach, JC, best coach. We really had a good rifle team all the years that I was there. But our senior year, we did really well.
So is that like live ammo in the basement?
22 rounds, yeah. Live guns. Remington 40XB was the gun I used. Shot 22s, and you shot in 3, standing, kneel, and prone. And yeah, we had matches. Shooting, yeah. Think about this, going to school and walking in with your rifle.
So you brought it home with you, like
I had
a trombone or something.
Yeah, you had your own rifle. You'd be bringing it into school. That, you have to think about how different the world is today. I mean, in high school, we had a limit on how long the blade could be in your pocket, in your knife that you brought to school. It couldn't be any more than 6 inches long for your knife that you brought to school. That was a different world than we live in today.
Well, and it's interesting with your father being a policeman and I know people hunted on the island, so it was probably definitely more of a gun culture, but where else did you see guns, or were you able to practice at home, or did he teach you?
No, I mean, we really couldn't practice at home, so it was always in a range. Although a couple times I did. Again, there was woods behind my house. So there was a couple times when my parents weren't home. I took my rifle out.
I didn't want to say, but
we'd set up some targets and do some shooting. But legally, you weren't supposed to be shooting back there. And a rifle bullet can travel a ways. But with a lot of BB guns. We used to have BB gun wars back in the day in the woods. That was another thing we'd do in the summer, having BB gun wars. You were only allowed 1 pump. But, of course, a couple people would always do 2 or 3 pumps on their.
Now, did you ever shoot against LaSalle, which is just down the road in Oakdale?
Yep, they were in our league. We'd shoot against LaSalle twice a year. Yep, we'd go into LaSalle every year as one of our away matches.
So just so people know, that was, and I've done an episode or 2 on them, it was a military academy, I guess, two towns over from you. Mm-hmm. Did it feel like a different world? Because they were sort of a gated community.
They were a strange bunch. There were a lot of the people that were there. I remember one time we came into the rifle range and they had army men down range that they had been shooting for practice, and then we're like, okay. But it was when I in the early '80s. Was it Noriega? His son was there.
Yeah, there's a whole stories. There's a lot of stories of whose sons went there.
Was it a lot of people from Central America? A lot of the people that had money sent their kids up there.
Do you know the story of the Sphinx? Is that something that was in your? The Sphinx
had been moved there to the I can't remember the name of the place, but right there on Montauk, it had moved there in the late 70s. They had found. I remember when they dug it up out of the clearing in Patchogue over near the not Patchogue, Blue Point, over near, it's right on the border of Blue Point, Patchogue. There's a couple of little
station,
lakes.
Right?
Yeah, a gas station. Yeah. It was behind there. And I remember them finding it, and it was a big deal, and then they transported it over to the whatever the garden store is there.
Flower houses. Yeah.
Yeah.
So just so people know, it was a roadside attraction. It actually dates to the early 1900s. Some guy built it in front of his hotel as a stopping thing. It's just literally the Sphinx, right? So it was just a white stone recreation of it. So you moved out, or late 80s, you started going to college and moving on with your life. And you have kids now, right?
Yes.
Other than what we've been talking about, what kind of stories do you tell them?
Well, and I let them know, hey, we're where the Hardy Boys are from, right? So Bayport's got that fame, and for the Hardy Boys, and which, by the way, is now public domain. You can actually create your own Hardy Boys stories as a podcast if you want. It entered the public domain this month, but we talk about that. Which is also, I think, why Bayport's high school is the Phantoms. I don't know if that connected or not to the Hardy Boys. But, I would tell them just about growing up, going in the woods. Basically your day was you'd wake up in the morning in the summer, you get on your bike, and you wouldn't come back likely until dinner time. And you hear your parents yelling. In the wintertime, we'd go play hockey in the lakes. Back then, things were cold enough to freeze back in the 70s. So there were ponds and lakes back there, and we would play hockey in those. And then every now and then someone would fall through the lake.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, when the first time you fall through a lake, you were shocked how cold that water was. It's interesting. I just now things don't freeze over. It's a lot warmer than it was in the 70s. In the 70s, every winter, those lakes froze over. We had ice skates. Everybody had ice skates. We'd go out there and play real hockey on the ponds and the lakes. And you'd have a few weeks, and there were stories. People would tell stories about the Great South Bay freezing over earlier, in the 40s and 50s. The bay would freeze over, and they could drive across the bay to Fire Island. So definitely things have changed.
And I don't know if you've seen the pictures of the old ice boats. They would do like the ice boat racing out there, these huge ships.
Yeah, so it's definitely things have warmed up on the island for sure. And the other interesting thing about Bayport is there's another fictional character now that's out of Bayport, which is Selena Gomez's character from Only Murder in the Building.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, so she was from Bayport, which I thought was interesting when I was watching. I was like, what? She's saying Bayport.
Did you see? But there was in the first season, they actually filmed a scene like they went back to see her cousin or something that was supposedly in Bayport, but it did not look anything like.
Yeah, and she had some drawings of Bayport as she grew up, and I'm like, no. And Bayport's got some interesting history. The high school, we used to have a thing called Bay Day, which was another interesting Bayport tradition, which was on May 1st. The seniors would take the juniors and throw them in the bay.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, and until I don't know, after a few years after I left, the kids went overboard and then made it Bay Week. Because you can't ever do anything without overdoing it. And then after it became Bay Week, then the school stepped in and said, no more, this is kidnapping. I don't know why you call it kidnapping, throwing a kid in the car and dragging him to the water and throwing him in the water. My friend, when I threw him in the bay, we said, hey, we got to go. And he was so gullible. I go, hey, we got to go down and pick up our other friend, John. His car isn't working. John lived right on the bay. So we get down there and we go, Steven, jump in or we'll throw you in.
Yeah, two choices.
We had a towel for him.
So now it sounds between your father and your uncles, do they go way back on the island, or they grew up there?
My dad was from Long Island, actually Belmore, so Mepham High School, and my mom also went to Mepham, but they actually didn't meet at Mepham. They were a few years apart, but both my parents are from Belmore and grew up there. But their parents moved out to the island in the 30s and early 40s. So I think my mom's parents moved to Belmore in the early 40s or late 40s, right after World War II. And my dad's parents moved to Belmore in the late 30s. And my grandfather used to work, of course, at Grumman, right?
Oh, yeah, sure.
So my father's father was Grumman.
And what's I've been asking people lately when I interview them from out of state. So as you meet people where you've lived, I think you're in, wherever you've
I'm in Nashville today.
Okay. What perception, if anything, do you find people have? Like if you tell them you're from Long Island, do they say, do they have a stereotype in their mind, or do they not even have any conception? The biggest stereotype when I tell people I grew up on Long Island is they think Long Island is like New York City. They think it's concrete. And then I go, no, I grew up more woods around my house probably than you had around your house. So, that I think is the biggest misconception that people had of the island. Now, again, where I grew up, we just happened to be real lucky to be the last house in a subdivision and surrounded on two sides by woods. But, I think that's one of the bigger misconceptions that people have
when I tell them I was on Long Island. They don't understand the island and the nature there is on the island.
And if you don't mind, I was going to ask you a few more minutes on podcasting, or maybe switch to the history of podcasting. And for full disclosure, I host this show on Libsyn. It's been a great experience. I'll throw that in there. And actually, I'll thank you, because I started podcasting in late 2005, and I learned how to write the RSS feed from the instructions you had up on Podcast 411. So thank you for that.
I'm glad I could help you. And I think in our history, if people don't know, you actually knew my mom before you knew me.
Yeah, so we alluded to Meadowcroft, which is sort of an Roosevelt estate in Bayport, and your parents are involved in that, right?
Yeah, my mom, we used to be run the Meadowcroft thing. You know, she was like, they have so many different presidents every year. They have different president, but I think she was president of Meadowcroft for a couple years, and then they had the winter thing where they decorate it and do all that. So she did her volunteer time there.
So just stick on parents for a minute. How do you explain podcasting to your parents?
You know, my parents still don't get it. I try to tell them it's audio on demand. That's what I've always just explained to my mom. She is the least technical. My house literally, when I used to use the joke flashing 12s when I started writing my tutorials, because my house, every time I go to my parents' house, I'd walk in, the VCR would be flashing 12. Because they never could set it, and they'd always unplug it. And every time I walked in, I was like, it's flashing 12 again. Okay.
So you've been involved in the growth, if we want to call it an industry, a medium. What do you remember first? What's your origin story with podcasting, if you go back to?
I mean, I started podcasting. I got into the space back in 2004. So it was October 2004. I read an article in Engadget. It said, if you want a podcast, just add this enclosure feed to your RSS feed, enclosure tag to your RSS feed, and your podcasting. And I was like, what are these? What, huh? So I went around and tried to find a tutorial on how to really do it, and there was none. So I wrote the first tutorial to tell you really how to create an RSS feed, which sounds like you actually read. And,
yeah, we found it. Yeah.
I'm glad you were able to find it. And so I was one of the first, basically one of the first 100 people out there podcasting. And I've been in the space since 2004 full time. Since like April 1st, 2005, I quit my day job and started podcasting full time, and got lucky. Had a few good clients, and then I got hired by Libsyn in 2007, and Libsyn was the first podcast hosting company. And I've been with Libsyn for almost 16 years now. So it's been a great run, and been lucky enough to be in this space since the very beginning, before Apple was even supporting podcasting.
And if you look at it, and I'll mention the show that I remember you doing is Podcast 411, where you were interviewing other podcasters, which is always fascinating. You know, it was so varied what people were doing. Do you see any difference from the type of people or the type of shows they were doing back then and the people that are doing it now, in their motivations or what they're doing or how they're doing it?
A lot of differences, I think, has to do with the early days of podcasting. A lot of people were very technical, or they were or had a musical background, hence why they had a microphone and they're able to do it. And that changed over time as things became a little bit easier. People got into to do storytelling, and then as the podcasting space has matured, people have now been getting into podcasting because, hey, I can make money at this. They think, they read articles about people making, Joe Rogan making $200 million, and to go, I can do that, and they get in. And unfortunately, that's not the reality. Most people don't ever make any money in it. But there are some people that do really well, and I know people that have quit their day job and have made 6-7 figures from podcasting, and kudos for them. But it's a very small percentage that get to that level. Now, the majority of people that still podcast today and start podcasting, I still believe, are doing it because it's something they want to talk about, a hobby, a passion. They don't want to do a blog. They'd rather do a podcast about the Islanders, or rather do a podcast about the Knicks. And there's quite a few of those out there. Maybe not so many on the Islanders, but you get the point.
Right. And just, again, I was trying to think of the ones I used to listen to back in the day. So what shows do you miss?
Bib and Yaz was one that I one of the early ones I listened to, and basically two guys that were kind of comedians and radio kind of wannabes, and they were one of the very early ones, maybe first 25, 30 people doing podcasting. So it was Bib and Yaz, and they had a really good relationship, but then or rapport on the mic, and ultimately the partnership fell apart. But I really missed that podcast on the early ones. But I'm still a big fan of Hardcore History with Dan Carlin, which another episode's coming out this week, and if you're I didn't say this out loud, but if you're into Vikings, it's going to be about Vikings. So yeah,
And he's took a long pause, or he was working on it for a while. It's been a while.
He's interesting. He doesn't release on any set schedule. He releases when he's ready, and his episodes are typically 4 to 6 hours long, and he gets millions of downloads an episode. And they're great. If you're a Love History podcast, it's by far the best history podcast. No offense, but as far as total number of downloads per episode, and he picks different topics. And this next time he's starting. I'm hoping he's starting a series on Vikings. I hope it's not a one-off, but that should be out within the week.
So the other thing is, I know a lot of podcasters on the island. From public libraries, and I do mine. I like to think of mine as a nonprofit, even though it's not really organized in any way. Where do you see that level of podcaster existing? The organizational podcaster, the school maybe, or public institution.
That's the thing I love about podcasting more than anything else, is that those any podcast, whether it's for a nonprofit, for a school, created in a school by students, lives side by side with the Dan Carlins and Aaron Mankey's of Lore and folks like that. So that's the beauty of it. It's not this inclusive, group. You have to be part of the group to get on and get distribution. Anybody can get the same distribution. And that's what what attracted me to podcasting in the early days was just a democratization of audio. The joke, someone said to me at NPR, this is an NPR person. They said to me, they go, NPR's guidance was meant to be to give anyone a voice. And when podcasting came around, some of the people inside NPR said, well, we didn't mean anyone. and
be careful what you wish for.
Right. And podcasting really is what NPR should have been, right? And it really is the democratization and allowing of anyone to have a voice and a podcast out there, good or bad. And then there are great podcasts covering every niche. There's one out there on chameleon breeding. There's podcasts, multiple podcasts about beekeeping. Any topic you can think of, you can find a podcast on, and that's what I love. Now, the other thing that's interesting is the number of active podcasts is much, much smaller than people think. The number of active podcasts has remained, and by active, I mean have at least released a new episode in the last 90 days. That number stayed under 500,000 for the last 2 years. And it's been pretty consistent. Really, the space really hasn't grown as far as total number of active shows. New people come in, people go out. We call it pod fading. But finding someone like yourself that's been podcasting since 2005, there's not many.
Well, I took a break for a few years, but at least this show since 2014. So,
but even there,
short gap.
Yeah, even then, it's surprising how few there are. People, they'll throw around numbers like 2.5 million podcasts, or Spotify recently said 4.7. Those numbers are completely made up. I don't want to do any profanity, but the reality is active podcasters, if you even take it down to active podcasts with 10 or more episodes, that number is under 400,000. And that's been also very consistent the last 2 years. So it's a great space to come into right now. Don't be afraid to get in and try it. You have something to talk about it.
Well, we want to thank you. I know we've taken up your time tonight. We appreciate it. And thank you again for sharing your history and the love of podcasting, which comes through, and the support of podcasting, which as one of your shows that you're hosting, I appreciate definitely. So thanks.
Chris, thank you for having me on. And if anyone has any question about podcasting, they can email me directly, rob@libsyn.com. Happy to answer any questions they have on podcasting.
thank you again to Rob Walch, son of Bayport, VP of Podcaster Relations at Libsyn. We can explain more about a lot of the aspects of Bayport history that he mentioned in our show notes. That's at longislandhistoryproject.org. We will link to past episodes on the Bayport Aerodrome, the Sphinx, and LaSalle Military Academy, so check those out. And I actually got in touch with the Bayport Blue Point High School to kind of verify the origin of their name. Their mascot is the Phantoms. Apparently there is a much deeper mystery involved in that. You'd expect no less from the hometown of the Hardy Boys, so we will follow up with them and hopefully report back to you on that. So we hope you liked hearing one man's story, a little personal history, a little local history. If you did, all we ask is that you share it with a friend, even that friend that you might have thrown in the bay. If you are off island, on island, an alum of Bayport Blue Point, or just a fan of local history, send this link off to someone in an email, post it on Facebook, tweet it out. Help us spread the word that there is a podcast out there dedicated to Long Island history. Our outro music is Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. And that does it for this episode. As always, thank you for listening.